We've got flags and banners, and if you mind your manners, we might even get to standards and what they represent. So just take my voice's hand and we'll both try to understand how this vexillologic podcast could be flagged for content. Flagged for content.
What's up, Vexheads, and welcome to episode 54 of Flagged for Content. It's the only podcast that got Dave Martucci on it this week. He has been on some lesser media like local news, etc. But folks, we got him on here as well. And, I think that's pretty cool. It is also a Flags for Good podcast, which I always mention. But now more than ever, we need to go to flagsforgood.com/flagged4content for like the number. And what we need as a society, I think, to do is order as many flags as we can, especially like these new ones that are coming out on the site all the time. And then I think at the end of the day, what we need to do is we should enter the promo code TheTarastark. That is TheTarastark at checkout. And I think we're going to save ourselves about 10%, and we're probably going to help a friend of the show. So behooves us to all go do that right now. Probably pause this, go do that. Anyway, come back and you're good. Okay, so this is an episode I've been excited about for a while. We've got Dave Martucci in the studio. He is, if there's someone more knowledgeable on the flags of the state of Maine, I'm sure Dave would love to meet them, because I do not know who that could possibly be. And I was super stoked to get Dave on the show. I met him at NAVA 57. It was so much fun. We had like a somewhat kind of brief chat there, really, touring, I think, one of the Revolution museums there in Philly. And, asked him if at some point he'd like to be on the show. Said, sure. There's a lot of stuff going on in Maine. And yeah, turns out there's a little bit of a delay on some of that stuff, but Dave is like interlocked with all of that stuff. He has some fascinating viewpoints on, you name it, as far as like Maine politics, Maine flag politics, Maine, anything mainline. He knows it. So I'm not going to bore you anymore. Let's go ahead and get into my chat with Dave, because we go over a little bit of everything. Let's go ahead and get into it. Folks, you're not going to believe it, but we have yet another amazing show for you this week. You know him as the Vexman. You know him as a past president of the North American Vexillological Association, and you know him as the Vexy Detective. It's Dave Martucci!
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, for coming on the show and everything. You've been a busy man with a few media appearances this week, I understand.
That's right.
Right. And you are coming to us, for those who are listeners and can't see on Dave's shirt there, you are coming to us from vacation land itself, right, Maine?
I live in the state of Maine, that's right. And we're working on some flag projects here that will affect the entire state.
Right. And yeah, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but from what I understand, there's been some recent developments that may kind of push that back a little, unfortunately, or...
Well, that's true. The Secretary of State has, just to back up for a second, they passed a law last year that got punted into this year, whether or not we want to go back to the 1901 flag as opposed to the current blue flag with the state coat of arms on it. Right. And so the Secretary of State has asked the legislature to consider pushing that back even further, another 2 years actually, to 2026, so that a commission could be created that would decide some of the thorny issues that have arisen, which sure. I have two feelings on it, but probably it's a good idea.
Yeah. We'll get into that, but I mean, regardless of the, slight delay, I'm sure you've kept busy, as you mentioned. How How are things in Maine? You mentioned off air that it's still feeling wintry up there, whereas I'm sweating here in Tennessee.
Oh yeah, we've had a bit of a storm today. We've got
Ah,
3 or 4 inches of snow on the ground, and it's supposed to turn over to freezing rain and sleet and back to snow, and who knows what we're gonna get.
oh my God. Yeah, yeah. I've never been to Maine, despite I went to school in Boston, and Massachusetts and Maine almost border each other, except New Hampshire wanted a little coastline, I guess. But
We were once
um,
part of Massachusetts.
well, right, exactly, just the northern part of the Bay Colony or Massachusetts. Or yeah,
Yeah, it's
I
a great
also,
place. I love it.
yeah. I'm sure. Like I've heard a lot of John Hodgman. Do you know him?
I do.
Yeah. He has a whole book called Vacation Land that I have not finished, but he's very very good ambassador for Maine.
Well,
As are yourself, I would say.
I came up to visit 50 years ago, and I'm still here. So
Oh, well, then that definitely says something. Yeah. So you went for vacation and you stayed for the land,
that's it. You got it.
I guess. All right, Dave. Well, that's all the time we have to talk about weather and such. Just the section that our listeners crave the most, so we get it out of the way first. But let's let's go ahead and move on to what is on the flagpole today. As always, we are going to have an underrated flag. We're going to have a whole category of overrated flags. Move into what it was like being the president of an organization like NAVA. We'll discuss collecting flags and flag accessories, and of course, chat about what's happening in Maine's somewhat near future that's informed by its past. But before we get into any of that, Dave, I like to ask my guests, what is the flag that got you into flags?
Oh, that would be the flag of Wales. It's Fred Cook, the Red Dragon.
Much better than I could say.
Well, I was in high school and flunking English class, and my teacher said, if you don't want to get an F on your report card, you better write a special report that gets an A. And I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, and I didn't like the concept of my father seeing an F on my report card, because that would not have gone down well.
No.
And one day I was floating around through the F volume of the encyclopedia, and I saw the article about flags, and there was the flag of Wales, white over green, with a red dragon, and it said that it was supposedly designed by Uther Pendragon, the father of King Arthur. And I remembered that every time the teacher in my English class brought up the stories of King Arthur, her eyes glazed over, and all she could see was Sir Lancelot. And so I figured, well, that might be an interesting thing to write a paper about. So I read up on the flag and realized what it was all about. Wrote the paper, did the drawing. I got an A on the paper. I got a D in the class, so nobody had to beat me. And then
Nobody
my
had to.
grandfather basically said to me, after he heard the story, he basically said to me, well, I have this friend in National Geographic who knows a bit about flags. He was some fellow that did some of the work on some of their flag issues. So I wrote to him at my grandfather's recommendation. And he
Huh.
said, well, I'm really not the guy you want to talk to. You want to talk to this guy outside of Boston named Whitney Smith, who runs a place called the Flag Research Center. So
Heard
I
of
wrote
him.
to Whitney Smith, and we became friendly. And I became his acolyte, you might say. He was my mentor. And I worked for the Flag Research Center for about 2 years when I went to college in Boston as well. And the rest is history.
Yeah, wow, that is a lot. I mean, just like the start of that alone, like finding the what would you say, like the F to I encyclopedia. That's not something that a lot of our younger listeners will have experienced.
Well, in reality, I was actually given an assignment in a earth science class, and the teacher allowed us to pick kind of a topic along certain lines. And I thought about it. The lines had to do with climate.
Uh-huh.
Surprisingly, it was a topic then. And
Uh-huh.
so I remembered we had gone to visit my grandfather when he lived in Florida, and I remember the Everglades, and there was a whole discussion down there as to how they affected the climate in that part of Florida.
Right.
So I went to the F volume for Florida. Actually, the E volume is where I went first, but there was nothing about the Everglades.
I was gonna
But
ask, yeah.
yeah, so I went to the F volume for Florida, and instead I found flags.
You didn't quite get to Florida in the alphabet. You're like, no, I'm stopping here first.
That's
We're in the
right.
this first FL thing seems interesting. Let's go there.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I'm very curious too because I know that the Welsh flag has, in the 20th century alone, changed at least once. Was the one you were looking at the current one with green all across the bottom, or was it the one with the dragon just standing on a little patch of green?
No, it was the current one with the green
Okay,
all along the bottom. So it was a white over green
yeah,
bicolor with a red dragon in the middle.
right. And so, what was it like? So specifically, was it the kind of like King Arthur, like the Arthurian legend to it that kind of like, combined with the design to make it really pop out for you? Or
I think it was more the initial curiosity was that it had an association with King Arthur, and like I say, the teacher was in love with those stories.
yeah,
And then when I started studying about it, I realized pretty quickly that there was way more to it than just a dragon on a white and green field.
sure,
There's
yeah,
a whole history involved there, and like any flag, it has its own story to tell in its own language, and
yep,
it's not something that everybody can interpret correctly. But once you study it a little bit, you realize what it's trying to tell you.
yeah. That's succinctly put. Yeah, every flag, I ask people this question all the time. This is episode 53. I haven't asked it on quite all of them, but yeah, everyone has a similar story of like this flag just seemed like it had a story to tell, and then it's like, well, what other flags have, what are their stories to tell? And then you just, if you're like me anyway, you get into a little bit of a rabbit hole and you're like, okay, I got to voraciously learn as much of this as I can as fast as I can. So
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that even the simplest flags have a important story to tell. You take
mhm.
like the French flag,
Yeah,
three
yeah,
stripes, blue, white, and red. How more simple can you get? And
hmm,
yet you could write hundreds of pages on each of those three stripes as to what they mean, where they came from, what the whole inspiration was, what it means to people today. I mean, it just goes on forever, really.
yeah. Very interesting. All right, so let's actually, yeah, let's start with the underrated, and yeah, let's do that next.
Well, I mean, I'm totally involved in the 1901 Maine flag, and I think that's underrated by a lot of people because they don't understand the history behind it. It actually goes back pretty far when you take some of the components and look
Hmm,
at what they really are and where they came from. Like the
hmm,
pine tree, for example, dates back probably 800 or more years in Native American culture, particularly in this part of the world, because
hmm,
the pine tree being a pretty ubiquitous species here,
yeah,
and some of the native nations they called themselves the people of the pine forest, um, and when the earliest European settlers got here, they recognized that as a symbol, and it was a symbol. I mean, the Iroquois used it 800 years ago, and it probably goes back way much further than that.
yeah,
And so it entered into European colonial iconographic symbols, as the New England flag, and that was associated with. That's
mhm,
right, and that was associated particularly with Massachusetts Bay, and so Massachusetts, of which Maine was once a part, was really our ancestral flag story, you might say. And
mhm,
we inherited the pine tree through them. In fact, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, when it adopted its symbols, adopted a coat of arms, which is on one side of their official state seal, but on the
mhm,
reverse, which in the 18th century, that was a common thing to have a seal with two sides.
mhm.
The reverse side is just a pine tree. And that was supposed to represent the eastern part of Massachusetts, which later became Maine. So we have used the pine tree for a very long time. And then part of the other symbolism are the colors, like the buff color and the blue star. Blue and buff are colonial colors, and they actually were taken from the Whig Party, which later became known as the Patriots here. And their colors were blue and buff, and they used those colors the buff color in particular, which was supposed to represent tanned deer hide, and that was supposed to represent standing stiff for American independence.
Okay.
So
Okay.
we have that connection, and then the original design for the tree on the flag had 2 cut off branches and 3 roots, and
Yes.
the 3 roots represent the 3 portions of government that support the tree, or the people, the legislative, executive, and the judicial. And
Mm.
then the 2 cut off branches represent the 2 portions of Maine territory that were lost over the years, New Hampshire in 1629 and northern Madawaska in the treaty between the U.S. and Great Britain settling the boundary in 1842.
Right. Well, that is yeah, I think you said it all. I think we're done here. No. um,
Well, that's why I say it's underrated, because
no,
nobody knows the
absolutely.
story.
Yeah,
And,
no,
and
absolutely. That
yeah,
is a fascinating story. There's a little bit of that I knew, like the buff color, and a lot that I didn't. But I think it may be better to kind of hold on to a little bit of that for that kind of main, no pun intended, section of the show here.
okay.
Because obviously we are going to be
I got
talking
out of hand. I know.
no, it's fine. It's fine. That is a excellent preview and better than I could have given. But yeah, we'll touch on that quite a bit. Let's move before we get into that to our overrated flag, or as I mentioned earlier, an entire category of overrated flags. I wonder what that could be.
Well, in my opinion, that's any flag with text on it.
Yeah.
If you have to put the name or some important part of your representation into language on the flag has failed its purpose. Its purpose is to convey certain things in a non-verbal manner,
Mhm.
to display the aspirations and emotions of the people who use the flag.
Mhm.
And if you have to spell out the name, besides the fact that it's on the other side, it's going to be backwards.
Right.
It's just not doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah, well put. Are there I was gonna say, yeah, definitely ones that say the place name directly, like Montana comes to mind among, many others.
Oh,
Um,
some of them display the name multiple times. I mean, there's at least 2 states that put their seal on the flag, which has their name on it, and
yeah.
then down below they put the name again. I mean, it's how many times do you want to say Idaho? I mean, it's just one of those things.
Just the once, just the once.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, no, that is interesting. I was gonna ask because there are other states like so a recent one that comes to mind is Mississippi's redesign, and
right.
they were a little bit kneecapped, I guess, in a way of like, well, you have to include this text on it. Whatever the final design is, it has to include "In God We
Right.
Trust." So,
Yeah.
from a design standpoint, like I don't really know what you do there if you have that directive that you have to fill out. But like, in your opinion, is that that "In God We Trust"? It could be anything that isn't the place name. Is that more egregious than saying the place name, or is it just on par, like any text whatsoever? Get it out of there.
So I think text is impractical for a couple of reasons. Like I just mentioned, it's obviously going to be in reverse on one side of the flag,
Yes. Yep.
unless you're doing a double-sided flag, which doubles your cost. The other thing is that if it's flying at the top of a 75-foot flagpole, nobody's going to be able to read it. So
No.
it becomes impractical to put those things on a flag if nobody can read them.
Mhm.
It's one thing if it's on a pole in a government chamber, where you can walk up to it and pull it out and look at it and read it. That's one thing.
Sure.
But when it's at the top of a flagpole and flying, or on the mast of a ship, or however you want to see it, you're
Yep.
not going to be able to read it. So
So just
that's really
any
the problem with it there.
Yeah. Right, right. So any text whatsoever. And as you mentioned, like the flag should be able to communicate on its own what like um a culture or state or whatever's like priorities are, what they hold dear, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So it should be able
And
to obviously
often mottos are done in Latin or French, and most people
dirigo.
nowadays
Yeah.
can't even read that. They have no idea what it's saying.
Right. They're not only in like Latin or French, but they're like in a little ribbon that I
Right.
would have trouble reading in English half the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. At least it's not Illinois where it's like, is it Illinois? Yeah. Where the ribbon that is like in the thing's mouth is like, what is it? State sovereignty, national union or something like that.
Yeah.
I think it's Illinois. But like all the words are like in such a weird like
Yeah.
formation.
And I mean, part of that goes back to the American rejection of heraldry. In heraldry, you have a shield of arms, you got a ribbon below with the motto on it, supporters on each side, a crest up above, but the flag is generally just what's on the shield.
Right.
Okay, so
Maryland, for example.
right. So when Americans got a hold of what they thought was heraldry, they would use the entire coat of arms instead of doing the right thing. So, for example, Maine's flag has got the word Maine below it. It's got the motto dirigo above it, the North Star, a sailor, a farmer, and then on the shield, it's supposed to be white. Nowadays, it's not. But anyway, it's supposed to be a white shield with a pine tree and a moose. Of course, Vermont has a pine tree and a cow. But anyway, let's not go there. So, in theory, if we were to follow heraldic custom, our flag would be white with a pine tree and a moose. Nothing else.
Gotcha. Yeah, I had not thought about that exact wrinkle of, I mean, I get told all the time, especially by like Christoph Hook, who, you know, is very big into heraldry and does a lot of flags in Czechia. But yeah, I get told all the time that Americans don't understand heraldry, and like it's never been more visible to me than the way you just laid it out. That makes absolute sense. All right, so I think that's going to be it for the first section here. We are going to go ahead and take a brief commercial break, and when we come back, we'll have more with Dave Martucci and get into some NAVA presidency stuff. We'll be right back. Okay, and as promised, we are back with more from Dave Martucci. Dave, as I said before we went to break, I would love to go into, you were president of NAVA between 1998 and 2004, based on what you just told me off air. And I would love to know, I don't want to leave it too open-ended, but like kind of what goes on with being the president of NAVA. I've talked with Stan, who's the current one, and I've talked a lot with Ted. And to me, the hierarchy of president, vice president, secretary is a little bit confusing. So I just want to know like what your roles as president were, and honestly what it was like in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Well, NAVA was at a crossroads in 1998. We had been not really growing. The membership that was stagnated at about between 300 and 325 for years.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also a debate going on within the organization as to whether we were going to be a big tent or a little tent organization, meaning are we only strictly for academics, or are we going to incorporate collectors and other people with some kind of an interest in flags that may not necessarily be the same as somebody else?
Sure.
And I took the helm at that point, mostly because I was asked to by Whitney Smith. And one of the things,
good reason.
Yeah, one of the things we immediately embarked upon was to try to increase the membership, which, you know, also increases our income level a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I wanted to do, which I think took a lot of people by surprise, I wanted to upgrade our publications. At that point in time, we had basically two publications. We had a black and white newsletter that was almost always photocopies of news clippings. And then we had the annual book-length Raven. And Raven had only been in existence for a couple of years at that point. And part of the problem I saw with Raven was that we were budget-wise stuck with a black and white publication.
Mm-hmm.
And flags, as you know, are not black and white. Well, there are some. But anyway, for the most part, they're a colorful thing, and color's important. Yeah. And so I embarked on a program to raise some money and to make our newsletter over into something a lot more interesting than it had been. And so we did some, you might say, example issues. Like we did one on the flags of World War II awards, and that was in full color. We expanded the magazine, we put it onto glossy paper, and it became, people really liked it. We began to grow our membership. At the same time, I put together a committee to help outreach, and that was very successful. And so my successors have kept that up, and the magazine has grown into what today is known as Vexillum,
Okay.
and the Raven is still published annually, but now it generally includes a series of color plates in it. So I think that was a big thing, and
Yeah.
certainly after I stepped down, the leadership was able to carry those projects further. And today the membership's over 1,100. So I think we were, very successful in that program to raise awareness and raise the membership level. I think the organization has grown considerably. The other thing I did was make sure that we had set up a web page and
Ah.
other digital outreach. That was very important. We had no such thing when I took over.
Okay.
Um,
So that leads to a good point, because like all the stuff you said about updating Vexillum and Raven and all that, like, that's pretty easy to conceptualize. Very good things that you did, obviously. But those I can get. When you say outreach, though, as you just mentioned, opening the website or starting up the website is going to just naturally do a lot for outreach. And I would probably guess, anyway, I don't know for sure, but invite a lot of younger members into the fold that maybe would not have seen it had it not had some kind of web presence. And obviously this is late 90s, early 2000s, so the tech landscape is a little bit different. But I'm wondering, like, as far as
yeah, I
outreach.
mean, yeah. The fact of the matter is, when we first set up the web page, I don't think hardly anybody knew it was there. So we had to get the word around to make sure people got aware of it. But
I guess
once,
I was
yeah,
going
go
to
ahead.
say that's what I'm wondering about. How did you get the word out and then make people aware of it?
Okay, so the outreach committee really worked hard at that, and they got involved in chat rooms and in other social media sites, which were very rudimentary in those days compared to today.
Sure.
But they spread the word around. They made sure that other organizations knew we were out there and we were on the web, and that if you had any information or questions that you needed to talk about, this was the place to go. And we set up a
Okay.
part of our site as a question and answer thing. So if you had a flag you didn't know anything about, you could submit a question, maybe a photograph. We would put it up there. And if we didn't know what it was, maybe somebody else did. And,
Right.
that took a few years, but it really took
Sure.
off at that point.
Absolutely. Like I said, like, the tech landscape at the time, late 90s, early 2000s, like, was there yet a Flags of the World or like a CRW Flags, that site online?
So Flags of the World started probably about a year or so before we put up our website.
Okay.
And it was started by an Italian fellow. Um, I'm trying to think of his name now. It escapes me.
Martucci?
Bottassini.
Bottacy.
Um, and Bottassini was a professor at a university in Italy, and his initial goal was to collect certain kinds of obscure information and make it available, stuff you wouldn't normally find easily. And
Right.
that grew and grew. He retired from it eventually. Rob Rayside eventually took over, and it's become like this giant flag encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Uh, some of the material on it is pretty obscure, I gotta say.
Right.
There's tons of material that I never even would have conceived of existing.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Same.
but I was an editor on that for a while,
Okay.
um, when it first started, and I think that was a worthwhile project. There were a lot of
Oh,
people who didn't like it. Whitney Smith actually was one who didn't like it because
Oh,
he was the purveyor of flag information to the world, and he found it difficult to deal with free information, which basically that's what this was.
right.
And so I spent some time trying to get him to see the value of it, and I think he kind of did at the end there, but
Yeah,
I'm not sure by how much. But
right, right.
it was a real transition for him and for a number of other people that were really trying to make their living off of selling flag information.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like at the start of this episode, we talked about how you found a flag in an encyclopedia and you
Right.
happened to come across the F to I one and be looking in there anyway. And now we've already moved into like you're setting up a website to and that's why I asked about Flags of the World too, is because you mentioned on the NAVA website that people can come and ask questions and get answers, and if somebody doesn't know it, somebody else does, kind of thing. So yeah, it's interesting to see all of that kind of growing up around the same time. And obviously, like you said, with Whitney, there's going to be some later adopters, some people that take a little bit longer to convince or whatever. But I
Yeah.
mean, overall, I don't think you can argue with the results, especially given the NAVA membership numbers that you cited. That was, you stepped down in 2004 and you said, I don't know if it was 300 when you stepped down, but you said 300 somewhere in there, and now it's almost 4 times that in just a 20-year period, and
Right.
it's been going on a while. So
Yeah.
yeah, well, I think I can speak for all Vex heads around the world when I say we definitely appreciate your work on all of that. It's made all of our lives easier, and yeah, pretty much it. It's made everything easier on our end and on NAVA's end, I imagine too.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was a good goal, I think, and we were able to kind of pull it off.
For sure.
Maybe not quite as fast as we had hoped, but everything is moving in that direction. So I wanted to
Yeah.
make sure the organization was on that bandwagon.
Yeah. You see the writing on the wall, and you're like, we got to get on that for sure.
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to also go into, as I mentioned in the flagpole segment up top, you both collect flags, but when we were talking off air, you said maybe the more interesting part is that you also collect what I've called flag accessories. Now, I assume that's like books and stuff, but can you kind of explain what you mean by that and what's in your collection?
I'm primarily a researcher, so books, manuscripts, information,
Mm,
that's my primary focus. I do have a flag collection, some of which I have actually purchased for research purposes, some of which was given to me.
it's always
I
nice.
do on the side, I do antique flag appraisals, and there have
Okay.
been times when somebody's come to me with a flag that they thought was going to be worth $1 million, and they come to find out it has very little value because it's a 48-star flag, nondescript from the post-war era,
Sure,
and
right.
they will sometimes just say, "Hey, just keep it," and so I have. I mean, I have a collection. I used to
Right.
have a client who's passed away now from Florida who had a large collection, and he had retained me to do the appraisals on it. And he gifted me a lot of flags over the years, some of which I thought were pretty interesting flags. For the most part, the only flags I really keep are ones I can use. So I have a 25-foot flagpole out here, and I do like my 4x6 and 5x8
Jealous.
flags.
Yeah.
That's what many of them I'll try to pass on to real flag collectors. I'm not really a flag collector, but I do collect books. I have some of the early editions of some of the vexillological books, like Admiral Preble's books. Those are quite valuable. Preble is an interesting character because he wrote about flags at a time when nobody else was,
Hmm.
and he he didn't write books the way we would write them today. The footnotes are very sparse, but
You went right to left and
he
yeah. No.
collected information from people who lived during the American Revolution and
Right.
early periods in our history, and he collected stuff that would be completely lost if he hadn't done his work. And
Yes.
so I'm a big, um,
Yeah.
I wouldn't call a fan, but I'm a big advocate of his works and understanding what he had to work with. He made a lot of mistakes. He created some myths that didn't need to be created. Um, but I did go one time to the I forget what it was. It's in Western Massachusetts. Uh, there is a repository of a lot of his papers, and I did go there and paw through a lot of his materials, and I could see where he got a lot of his information from, which is not information that was in his book. And it's really fascinating. And like I say, a lot of it is early source material that would just be lost if he hadn't collected it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I know like those who have been to a NAVA, you and I actually met at NAVA 57 briefly, but those who have been to any kind of NAVA meeting will know the Preble lecture is kind of the thing that
Right.
starts it all off, kicks it off, and that's named after and in his honor.
Yeah, he
Um,
published his first book in 1872, but
yes.
he actually had been collecting information since the 1830s. He was
Did
he
he?
was in the Navy, and the Navy, of course, always has a lot of flag activities, and he
Yeah.
collected information so that the Navy would have the latest information available on what flags to fly or not fly. And
Okay.
so he was a collector from an early period.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Totally. I was gonna ask. So 1872. Did he focus? Did he do most of his work on like American, like U.S. flags, or was it kind of a little bit of everything? I'm just curious. I don't know.
So the first volume of his book was the first couple of chapters was devoted to the history of flags in general. And then he devoted another couple of chapters to flags in Great Britain and Ireland. And then the rest of it was the story of the American flag. And of course, he was an admiral during the Civil War, so he had
Mhm.
extensive chapters on U.S. and Confederate flags at that time. He
Right.
probably was able to find out more about that than anybody probably could have. And to
Yeah.
give you an example of what I'm talking about, during the Civil War and immediately afterwards, captured flags were turned over to the War Department. And the War Department actually had a repository of those, which they kept until 1905. And they kept a big book, a register, and it would list all the flags they had and anything they knew about them. And every flag had a number stamped on it. And in 1905, they divested themselves. They returned all the captured flags, and the ones they couldn't figure out what to do with went to museums, various places. And
Sure.
so
Yeah.
that collection, which is very valuable as far as understanding the design and usage of flags at that time, was dispersed. And we never have had that as one body of study since.
Right. All
So
in one
so he
spot.
was able
Yeah.
to actually see those flags and make some
That'd be
comments
something.
about them. So he was pretty active right up to the end of his life. He died about,
Yeah.
I don't know, 1910, 1912, somewhere in that range.
Okay.
He
Yeah. I
was an
mean,
old
that's
man when he died, but he
that's
was he was the Navy's go-to guy about flags.
Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna. Yeah. That's why I lingered on 1872. Is that uh, especially in American history, yeah, the Civil War had just ended in 65. And so obviously there's, as you said, a lot to draw on, a lot to collect there. I didn't know if he did international stuff because I know the Franco-Prussian War wrapped up in 1871, just right before that. And
Yeah,
didn't know if he had any like kind of knowledge of any of their regimental, like I've studied a lot of their Prussian and French like regimental flags from around then,
yeah.
but
Well, he
yeah,
had
that's
quite a
got to
bit
be a
to
very
say about the
cool.
Napoleonic era, but I don't think he said too much about that one.
Yeah, yeah, fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it was more.
His
Yeah,
later editions focused solely on U.S. flags. All the
fair.
international stuff was cut out of it, and
Gotcha.
and even though the book was expanded in length, it actually had less foreign material in it.
Fair,
You know,
fair. Yeah.
brief statements about British flags and how they evolved into ours.
Right. Yeah, you did say British flags. Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we lingering here in your collection, just in general, I put out a call on our Discord for questions from like listeners and just from the
Sure.
Vexes. And I think instead of doing them all at the end, it's kind of pertinent to put these two here. Erik Nystul from Utah. I don't know if you've had the pleasure of talking with him, but he was pretty instrumental in pushing through their new flag. But he's in our Discord, so just shout out those who want to join the Discord. But anyway,
Hi, Erik.
Erik, Erik wanted me to ask, what is the oldest flag in your collection?
Wow. The oldest actual flag? I have some flags that came from Harvard University. They were divesting a collection in 1971 or 72 that they had that they used for events when they had international people there.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those flags are pretty old. I would say they're probably World War I vintage or maybe earlier. I do have at least two 48-star flags from the First World War. I have a Civil War flag, a very, very, very small U.S. flag of 13 stars that was a hand waver, as we call it, from the Civil War. That's probably my oldest flag.
Wow. Yeah, wow. That
Yeah.
I don't know what I was expecting, but
I have the only existing 1901 Maine flag that's in Maine. There are several other copies outside the state, but I have the only one in Maine.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely get to that as mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, very cool. Evan Stewart from the Discord just wanted to ask, what flag are you the proudest of in your collection? And that may be a difficult one.
Yeah, that's pretty difficult. I don't know if I would use the word proud.
Sure.
I'm pleased to be the owner of that 1901 Maine flag. It's an original. I do like to fly large flags, and I have a number of them. They're not old, but there's a number of them I like to fly. I do have a replica of that 1901 flag. I've got some, like, for example, Maine was the 23rd state, and I have a 23 Great Star flag that I had made up. Those I'm pretty happy to fly.
Okay.
So maybe that's a definition of proud. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's very up to interpretation. I mean, I definitely understand that interpretation of it. If I wasn't proud of it, I wouldn't be flying it from my 25-foot flagpole, kind of thing.
And really, my collection is focused on printed materials in general, and I have some pretty good stuff. I have a few books that are pretty rare editions. I'm happy to have those. They're great research materials.
Yeah, I guess like spinning off of both those two questions, oldest, which one are you the proudest of? Like, is there a book or a like any kind of flag accessory, as I put it, that may fit that bill?
Yeah, I mean my first edition Preble is one of my.
Yeah, I figured it would be that one, but
I have a copy of Maine in the War, which was printed in 1865. That book, it doesn't have a lot of flag material in it, but the flag material it does have in it is precious because it's stuff that we would really have no idea about. For example, when the 3rd Maine Regiment, the first 3rd Maine Regiment, left Bangor and went to New York City, the Sons of Maine in New York City presented them with a special flag, and that flag still exists, although it's pretty badly shredded, and you can't really tell what was on it. But there's a description of it in that book, and the description of the flag and how it came to be. And the flag was actually made in New York, and the Society of Maine, what was it called? I think the Society of Former Maine Residents, I believe, is the name of it. But anyway, those people had a flag made with the intention of presenting it after they got it, to the 1st Maine Regiment to come to New York, which happened to be the 3rd Regiment, the first
Right.
3rd Regiment from Bangor. And so that flag actually has no regimental description on it.
Okay, gotcha.
Usually flags in those days said, 3rd Regiment Maine Volunteer, something on it. This one didn't. And like I say, not much of it's left today. They carried that for a long time in battle. That was more cherished to them than the state colors that were presented to them in Augusta.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's asked and answered. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Speaking of Maine, I think that's probably a good point to go to another commercial real quick and just let everyone know that the primary part of the episode will be coming up where we discuss the Maine flag right after this. What's up, Vex heads, and welcome to an advertisement. I think I legally do have to say that here. You're always welcome to check out the Patreon. In any case, this is an ad that I would not be doing at all if I didn't think this company was super cool. They are called stubforge.com, and what they do is they print actual paper tickets to events that you've been to, but maybe had to use like your phone for the QR code or the scan thing or whatever. And for those of us who are old heads, this is absolutely huge. As an anecdote, about 2 years ago, I got my mom these cool ticket display frame things you can hang on the wall to prove that you did, in fact, used to be cool. And as someone else who also used to be cool, I kind of wanted to buy some for myself to hang up, but realized I don't think I have enough paper tickets to actually even fill out one of the things. So, Stubforge to the rescue. They print all their tickets on the same stock that Ticketmaster and all the companies Ticketmaster has bought use. Their website is super intuitive and idiot proof, which I know because I've used it. And they offer bulk discounts for literally anything over one ticket. So if you're looking to fill out your back catalog with shows you have seen but don't have tickets for, Stubforge is your new best friend. And as someone planning a wedding here in 2024, I am checking out their invites and I really like what I see. So in any case, as I said, most of us are collectors of various stripes, so head on over to stubforge.com to do what us Vexans always do, fill that collection up. Now back to either the show or another ad, I have no idea. All right, and we are back, more from Dave Martucci and myself, and as mentioned, this is going to be, stop trying to wordplay around it, this is the main segment for the show, and obviously, as the main expert, Dave has put on his main cap even. I thought a good place, and I say this all the time on the show, but I think a good place to start with this is at the start, and in this case, what I mean by that is, let's go back, let's time travel a little bit to 1901, where Maine has the flag that's on your hat. A little, the one I have behind me is a little stylized version, which we'll get into those as well. But I just want to know, so it's called the 1901 Maine flag, but when was it actually adopted and how long did Maine technically have it as a state flag?
It was adopted in March of 1901.
Okay.
And it lasted until March of 1909.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there
the story goes back actually prior to that flag. So prior to the Civil War, Maine had militia colors, as we call them, that were basically white with the shield of arms from our coat of arms.
Yep.
There's a whole story there involved, but I'm not going to get into that right now. When the Civil War broke out, the very first regiments that went carried these white flags into the field. But the problem with a military unit carrying a white flag
is the obvious
that
one.
Could be mistaken for the flag of surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, there is an additional problem in that very quickly Confederate flags were primarily red, and so the Union forces adopted primarily blue flags for their regimental colors. And so very much at the end of 1861 and into early 1862, almost all northern units switched over to a blue flag with some kind of emblem on it. In almost every case, it was the state coat of arms or seal. And that's why so many northern states have blue flags with their state coat of arms on
I
it.
was just going to ask. Yes.
Yeah. That's
Was
where that comes from. That's almost universal. At one time it was. It's not quite so much universal anymore, but that's a good thing.
sure, yeah.
And then in 1901, the original proposal was a blue flag with the state coat of arms on it. That was the original proposal that went into the legislature. But the Adjutant General, General John Richardson,
That's
he,
my grandfather's name.
yeah, he said, you know, that's not a good thing because that's what everybody else uses. And he also thought that a flag that's going to be used not only by the military, but also by non-military people and on ships and on tall poles, he said, no, that's not going to really cut it. So he came up with the idea of the buff flag with the colonial colors, buff and continental blue for the star, with the state's primary symbol, the pine tree, in the center of it. And he promoted it. The legislature adopted it. He, as the adjutant general, was given the job of having a model flag made and kept in his office for people who wanted to have flags made up. And he had a lithograph made of what that flag is supposed to look like. And that flag is actually, it's actually this design right here. And
Right.
as you can see, the tree has 3 roots and 2 cut off branches.
Yeah.
And that was important to him.
That's the one
And
you were talking about at the beginning. Yeah. Yeah.
right, and almost all existing flags from that period, more or less, look like this. It was also the symbol used on militia buttons and other paraphernalia. So, for a short period of time, it was actually pretty widespread.
Right. Right. And as you said, like, so there are surviving versions of that one. But I'm
Right.
wondering, like, so the one that you have on your hat is based on some of those surviving versions where you're talking about the 3 roots, the 2 missing branches, etc. I'm wondering, like, how does that get repurposed and restylized into, say, the one I have behind me, or and this may tie in, but the Maine Merchant Marine flag. I think it's the Merchant Marines.
So the Marine flag was adopted in 1939. Its primary impetus was the exploration of the Arctic by Commander Donald McMillan on the schooner Bowdoin, and he wanted a flag that was simpler than the state flag. He, being a nautical man, complicated flag with words, and you got a farmer, a sailor, a moose, a pine tree, a star, all kinds of things on there, a forest scene. I mean,
Yeah.
he just thought that's way too much, particularly if he had to make another flag in the field, because in the Arctic things
Sure.
wear out pretty quick.
Right.
So the legislature adopted a simple flag, a white flag with a stylized pine tree, the cartoon tree, as I call it.
Yes.
And it had an anchor across the trunk, a blue anchor. And that was the original proposal, but the committee that got a hold of it added the word Maine up above and the word dirigo down below in a curved thing, because they just couldn't help themselves. And so he accepted that, and that the only known existing original flag from 1939 is on this. Well, it's no longer. It was found on the schooner Bowdoin many years later, during op sale in New York in 1986, I think it was, and that flag now hangs in the administrative offices of the Maine Maritime Academy.
Yeah, that's true. And not that I was going to fact check you on it, but I did actually have that up on my screen here, somewhat unintentionally. I was like, oh, yeah, it says it's at the Maine Maritime Academy. I'll have to
Right.
go check that out when I'm in Maine. So, all right. So that's very interesting. One, we've gone through the the original, the 1901 flag, as it's called. And then we've gone to this dirigo Maine merchant marine thing for the Bowden exploring up north, all that. Let's kind of not bridge the gap, but like what happened in between those two things?
As you might well be aware, a blue flag with a state coat of arms on it is not a big seller.
No.
And you don't see a lot of them flying around.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2017, a company in Portland, Maine, the Maine Flag Company, I believe they're called, they decided to make, they started out making the Merchant Marine flag, but they decided to make some of the 1901 flags using the tree from that Merchant Marine flag, and it took off. I mean, everybody and their cousin wanted to buy one, and it started to appear on merchandise, and they're pretty savvy business people, and they thought, hey, this is a good thing.
Yeah. Can I like briefly ask? So like the reason that they slapped that, like a version of that dirigo Maine merchant marine one, that tree, is the reason for that because that dirigo Maine one was still somewhat popular in 2017, or?
Oh, not at all.
Okay.
No, I mean, other than the main training vessel of the Maine Maritime Academy, at the time, you almost never saw the merchant and marine flag.
Because I was wondering, I was just wondering, like, if it was an established symbol in some way that they were like, hey, we've got this tree that's established, but that's not the case. No.
So Maine and Massachusetts, you might say Texas too, they're the only states that have two state flags. Texas, they actually had a marine flag back in the 1830s, but they haven't used it since then, really. But Maine and Massachusetts are the only two states that have on the books official different versions of their state flag for use at sea. We're the only two states that have that as a law. And actually, they're quite similar. Ours is, like I say, white with the pine tree and an anchor and motto and the state name. Massachusetts is just white with the pine tree.
Oh, okay, I'm seeing that
essentially, it's essentially the Jack version of the New England flag.
Yeah, I was going to say the pine tree is stylized like at least the New England flag I have. Yeah.
Originally, it had a motto that said "an appeal to heaven."
That's what I was going to ask. Sorry, go on.
That was adopted during the Revolutionary War, and in 1971, a commission was formed about the state flags, and part of what they did was remove the motto to make it an easier flag to make. I will also point out that the stylized version of tree is easier to sew if you're using the applique method of sewing.
Yes.
So that's partly why the Maine Flag Company decided to make those, because they're fairly easy to make, and everybody wanted one. They tapped into a whole thing there that nobody knew that market existed at all. I mean,
for sure.
And then since then, there's dozens of companies, or at least a dozen, maybe more, companies that are making various versions of that. And for the most part, they're trying to make them a little different because they don't want to get sued. And so there's all kinds of variants. I mean, there's a market there. And again, nobody really wanted the blue flag with the coat of arms. I mean, some people do, but very few.
It's the voting with your wallet thing that Utah and Minnesota and other places are finding.
So I wrote a paper about this in 2022, I guess, basically given the history of the flag. And I concluded it by saying that because the Maine legislature just voted down the proposal to go back to the 1901 flag at that point. And I concluded that the people of Maine have already made their decision. The legislature just hasn't caught up yet. So now they've kind of caught up. They were not brave enough to just pass the law. They had they wanted to go to referendum, but I actually was involved in a number of attempts to reinstate the 1901 flag. The first one was in 1991, where we got 0 votes in committee, And then in 1996, we did a much better. We got one vote. And so, it's come a long
I mean, that's
way.
100% increase.
There you go.
You know?
It's come a long way over the years. I'm not as much the mover and shaker as I once was, but there are plenty of people now involved in the effort. So it's a little easier for me as I've gotten older that other people are picking up the mantle and moving it forward, as you might say.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple questions just off of that. One, since we were talking about the tree, the stylized version, as you mentioned, there are even different stylized versions. The one I have behind me is from Flag for Good, but I know, as you said, Maine Flag Company has one. There's the one on your hat. I can't remember if the one on your shirt matches the one on your hat or not even.
It does not.
Okay, that's part of what I was going to ask is, do you have a preferred version of it? And I'm sure you do. And why?
Okay, so there's two answers to that question.
Okay, there's two questions, so that's fair.
So the first answer is this. The 1901 law, which is going to be reinstated if it passes referendum, all it says is a pine tree proper in the center of the flag. So any of these would meet the requirements of the law.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
That what that means to me is we have the potential for more flags being flown, and I'm always in favor of that.
And that's 100%. The goal. Yes, yeah,
that's my goal.
Right.
I do like the Adjutant General's tree with the roots and the cut off branches because they have a lot of symbolism that I'm fond of.
I'll say that's my favorite, and I will go on to say, very brief aside here, that I don't mind so much if a child can draw it from memory thing. A child can draw a tree and a star on both. I'm not going to get too precious about it, but I do prefer the one on your hat.
And to give you the opposite side to that, some people will say, "Oh, the present flag's just fine." Well, the problem is there is no flag anywhere in existence that meets the law for the present flag. The present flag law is very detailed. It requires a 4'4" by 5'6" silk flag with the coat of arms as established in 1820, embroidered in the center. It has to have a 2.5-inch gold silk fringe. Has to be mounted on a 9-foot pole, not counting the brass spearhead and ferrule. And it has to have a blue and white twisted silk cord and tassel set to be official. That's what the law requires.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's tell me you're not a flag expert without telling me you're not a flag expert kind of thing.
Yeah. And here's the thing. The law also requires the Adjutant General to have the model flag based on that description in his office. And I've gone to that office. And what he's got is he's got a 6.5-foot pole with a brass spearhead. I got to say, he's got
the
that
ceilings. I mean,
yeah, and it's nylon with a printed flag on it.
Yeah,
and it doesn't meet any of the requirements of the law other than the spearhead.
Right, which is, yeah, it's like if even your Adjutant General can't, quote unquote, live up to that or whatever. That's different for sure. Especially the silk thing. And I feel like there's some kind of similar thing you may know about Alabama's flag. The proportions are supposed to be they're pretty pedantic about exactly.
So Alabama's flag is required to be square. Okay.
Is that right?
The proportions are square. And it's based on the Confederate battle flag, which was square. And the fact of the matter is you're never going to find one unless you have it custom made.
Right. Yeah, just interesting.
We don't use square flags anymore.
No, not too much. Rhode Island kind of tried, but theirs is 19 to 22 or something. It's weird.
Right. They have a very weird proportion. And again, that proportion is based on a military color, a specific military color.
Yeah.
It also is supposed to have fringe on it, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
That's so, I mean, in the 19th century, this made some kind of sense. And into the early 20th century, because those were the kind of flags that were in use. They were in use by the militia, and it was probably not that complicated to get one.
Right.
But today, nobody makes flags out of silk anymore. You can special order one, and it's going to cost you a fortune.
Mm-hmm.
And forget about embroidery. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody hand embroiders anymore.
No. Yeah.
I mean, it's like the specifics of the manufacture and the materials just don't exist anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Just a brief question, kind of based on the fact that the tree isn't maybe specifically codified or whatever. From what I understand, the buff color also falls into that category. Where, as you mentioned up top, the buff color is meant to be, like a tanned deer hide, etc. But obviously, when you tan a deer hide, there are different, different levels of tan and different, the hide's different. Like,
True.
there's a lot in play there. So is the buff, like, is it any better defined, or am I correct in thinking that it's just kind of a vague suggestion as well?
It's also very vague.
Okay.
Technically, buff can be, if you were going to match a tan deer hide, it can be anywhere from almost pure white to very, very dark.
Mm.
Today, the only flags in the United States that are buff, there's a couple of military colors, but the state of New Jersey has a buff flag, and they have specific color requirements that they have a defined
Okay.
color in mind there.
So they call it buff, but they also give like the Pantone or the,
Right.
whatever. Like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That is interesting, because I would not have thought of, I know New Jersey's flag, as most of us Ducks heads do, but I would not have called it buff, I guess, in a vacuum.
Yeah. So New Jersey gets its field color from the same place we did in 1901, from Revolutionary War era. In their case, the middle states were assigned uniform colors by George Washington of continental blue with buff facings. And so the at the time, military flags for the units were based on the facing color. So buff was the correct color. New York at one time had a buff flag, but after the Civil War event, they went to the blue one.
Yeah, differentiate from New Jersey, I guess.
I guess.
Or something. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting.
And that's why Massachusetts and Rhode Island have white flags, because during the Revolutionary War, their uniforms were blue with a white facing.
Right.
At one time, New Hampshire had a white flag too.
Yeah, that makes it. Yeah, New Hampshire's a whole different. Well, that'll be a whole different episode, I think. What's going on there? But so I did, as I mentioned, I had a few more questions from the folks in Discord that tie into this. Smix, who he's Max from Sweden. I don't know if you watched his episode, but he lives in Stockholm, Sweden, and has done a lot of work, especially on county flags in North Dakota. He wanted to know, well, he says rather, I'd like to know how he thinks vexillology in Maine will develop now that the state flag is getting attention. And kind of the second part of that is, he, as in you, have done some municipal flag proposals. Could a state flag change be a promising start for more changes? In other words, do you think it's the first kind of domino that helps out a lot of other stuff?
Yeah, so I would say the answer to that is yes. There already are interests shown by some of the municipalities. Just a couple of years back, the city of Bath adopted a really nice new flag that Jeremy Hammond designed. And there are a number of communities that are talking about it. I've had some contact with some of those.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to wait and see how far that goes.
Yeah.
There's certainly an interest among people about flag design.
Yeah.
You can see that in the news clippings and some of the comments that have been sent directly to me. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes. But I think yes, absolutely.
Right, yeah. I think it'd be hard not to. Just like it gets the flag or flags in general, rather, into the popular conscience. And it's like, okay, well, while we're thinking about this flag, like, now that I think of it, I've never seen my city flag or my county flag or whatever. Let's maybe again, get the ball rolling on that.
Yeah.
And to that point, he actually does. He kind of got overzealous with the questions here, Max. We're going to talk after this, but no, I'm just kidding. He says he did say, and what does he think about the importance of county flags compared to city flag, and does he have any plans to maybe promote his proposals?
So I spent some time in the late 70s, early 80s promoting municipal flags in Maine. I can't say that I got very far. My own town adopted a flag, but other than that, there wasn't too much interest. I think that interest might be more now. Will I promote them? I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
As far as county flags go, Maine has a weak county government system. The municipalities have a lot more power and authorities than the county.
Right.
However, a number of the counties do have flags, and I do know that there's some interest in at least one other county adopting a flag. And there's a couple of cities. We have, I don't know, 8, 9 cities in this state, as opposed to towns.
Yes.
And city government seems to be much more interested in flags than any other type of government. There's at least one city, the city of Rockland, Maine, that adopted a flag, and they don't know what it looks like. They don't know what happened to it, whether it ever got made or not.
Wait. Sorry. Pause. What?
So back in 1974, city of Rockland, Maine, held a contest to adopt a city flag.
All right.
And there were 2 winners that tied for first place, you might say.
Okay.
So the city hired an artist to combine the 2 ideas into a single flag. That design was presented to the city council and adopted. A week later, an election happened and the entire city council was voted out of office. And what happened to that flag is unknown to this day. I don't even know what the design looks like because it's never described fully in the newspaper materials that I was ever able to get a hold of. And the guy that did the consolidated artwork, Edgar Crockett, I believe his name was, he's passed away. And I've talked to some of his family members, and they don't know what I'm talking about at all.
Really? So that's
So
literally
that's
every part of that is interesting in its own way.
Municipal flag.
That is wild. I've never heard. And that's you said that was a municipal, not county, correct?
Yeah, municipality, city of Rockland.
Rockland, that's what it was. Okay, yeah. So I'm definitely going to go look that up, and I bet quite a few of the listeners and viewers are going to pause it right here and go look that up as well, because I know
you're not going to find much about it. There's a couple of newspaper clippings. That's about. See,
Dave,
I've done a lot of research.
I was going to say, you called yourself the Vexy detective up top here, so we got to, put that.
That's one of my primary functions in life, is to ferret out missing flag information, and I have spent a lot of time going through archives and news clippings and people's diaries and trying to interpret somebody's bad handwriting. And, you find some interesting things in those places. Sometimes not at all what you're looking for. And I try to keep track of that material too, so that if I ever have to go back and look for it again, I know right where it is. But
makes sense.
The city of Rockland it's actually my county seat. I live in Knox County, Maine. And
wait, what county?
Knox.
Oh, I'm from Knox County, Tennessee.
There you go.
Same spelling.
Probably the same Knox, but not really. Not really. Henry Knox, the first Secretary at War, lived here after he retired.
I think ours was John Knox, but anyway.
Yeah. So anyway, I started out by saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice if Rockland had a city flag?"
Yeah.
And I came up with what I thought was a nice design that was related to lighthouses and the beehive, which is on their city seal. And and when I started looking into it more to make sure that we didn't have anything else we needed, I fairly quickly came upon a news clipping from 1974, which talked about the city flag. And I did some research on that. And I went down to City Hall and asked them about it. And the city clerk at the time said he'd never heard of a city flag. And then he went into their archives and found the papers relating to the adoption of it, but it didn't describe it. And so he said, I have no idea what
The
happened to
flag
it.
shall be as follows: a flag.
Well, it basically says that the drawing done by Edgar Crockett is hereby adopted as a city flag.
But it
And
doesn't
nobody knows where the
elaborate,
drawing is. The
and we
drawing
don't
is
know where.
vanished.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep. That makes
yeah.
well.
He filed the resolution, but not the drawing, and so not him, but his predecessor.
Sure, you're right.
I can't blame the current city clerk for that, but
Yeah.
it's like that's so frustrating. But
That is
I keep thinking someday something's going to pop up somewhere,
in somebody's
and then we'll
attic,
finally
or yeah.
something. And there is a couple of like, for example, the local newspaper is only available on 1 or 2 days a week on microfilm. I don't know if you've ever worked with microfilm, but that's some of the most frustrating material to work with, because you have to make educated guesses as to where something might be, and it takes forever.
I was gonna
And
ask about
yeah,
microfilm, like microfiche
yeah.
stuff, because I figured.
So there may be more of a description in that material, which I haven't had a chance to go get. But like the Bangor Daily News, which is where I found the clippings that told me about it, that's available online. That was
Yeah,
fairly
yeah.
easy to get. But
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's going to Google that after this. Just two quick things. One, they were apparently both named after Henry Knox, both our counties.
there you go.
And two, yeah, I worked at the my freshman year at Boston University. Shout out Whitney Smith again. I worked in the library, Ugar Memorial, another shout out. And yeah, there was a lot of microfilm, microfiche down there, and they were teaching us, like, when we were doing orientation, all that stuff. Like, now you want to be very careful with this stuff, and you really, like, actually just don't touch it. And eventually we're like, we're gonna delegate this to somebody else. You guys can forget everything we taught you. Anyway, microfilm was fun. That was the point of that rambling sentence that I just laid out. But to get back into the vein of things, the next couple questions are from Tara Stark, but they kind of tie into a larger point that you touched on up top, which was, this is all very much like, it is in motion in Maine. There is legislation that's moving through, but I guess moving through very slowly. And from what I heard from both Michael Green and from Tara Stark today, is that, and from yourself, I guess, is that they're going to kind of punt this thing to 2026. Do you have any kind of detail on, like, why?
So the Secretary of State, Shana Bellows, she was concerned that there may be a problem with presenting the referendum question, in that we're talking about graphic design, and she felt it was important to have a voter guide which showed the two flags that would be voted on. You'd be voting for the blue flag with the coat of arms, or the puff flag with the pine trees.
Right, because this is a different animal from Minnesota, where it's like,
right.
Yes, for sure. Go on.
Yeah. So she was educated to realize that it's not a simple thing, that there are dozens of variants of both flags in existence, and that the current flag, the blue one with the coat of arms, doesn't exist in any official format. So her answer to that conundrum, rather than just avoid the voter guide and just have the language out there, her answer to that was to form a commission which included herself or her designee, a chair or leader of a statewide arts and humanities organization, a graphic designer, a graphic designer. There are two more people. One's a vexillologist, and then I forget who the fifth one was, but five.
That's right. Put it in post.
Educated people. Oh yes, the state archivist. That was the other one.
Okay.
And to have that commission formed and study the issue and put together a report as to basically what it is we're talking about.
Right. Okay. So
And she estimates it'll take 2 years.
yes. And so that
I,
2 years.
I don't think it should take more than 5 minutes, but that's just my opinion.
Right. Okay. Yes. And speaking of your opinion, that is actually Tara's first question on this was, how is Dave and how are the locals, if you've, kind of got a finger on the pulse of the community or the state, really, how are y'all feeling about the decision to potentially delay a vote to 2026? Basically, yeah. Just expand on your thoughts on that. I guess we've got a couple of them here, but
So my immediate gut reaction is we don't need to wait.
right. Yep.
I feel very strongly that the vote would be positive if it were held today. On the other hand, there's a lot of doubters and naysayers about, and we might be able to convince more of them and have a bigger vote. I don't know.
Right. Right.
The fact that she specifically said one of those commission members has to be a vexillologist, and knowing there aren't a hell of a lot of us in this state,
I was gonna
I
ask.
might be able to be involved in that. I hope. But we'll
Yeah.
have to wait and see how that pans out.
Yeah.
I am not totally opposed to the idea. After all, I've been at this whole project since 1991. What's a couple more years? But anyway, hopefully I'll live long enough to see it come to fruition. But I'm as a researcher, I always feel more education is better than less. So I'm not totally opposed to the idea.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I guess like maybe the more, well, not more, but like, well, yeah, maybe the more interesting part, since we've already gone into your feelings on the matter, the more interesting part of that question to me is like, how are the locals feeling about it? And by that, I just mean, and I think Tara means like, do you have any kind of sense of like, your neighbors, the local community? Is this being talked about a lot in Maine, or is it kind of just something that the legislature is dealing with, and obviously us as flag enthusiasts are thinking of, but maybe isn't on everyone?
So let me just answer this by saying anywhere you go in this state, you're going to see lots of buff flags with pine trees and stars on them.
That's the sense I get, but I've never been.
And I feel very strongly that that's a commentary by the people of the state.
Yep.
Very strongly. I was interviewed on Channel 6 News a few nights ago, well, a week or so ago.
Right. Some inferior media. Go on.
Yeah, one of the things that Don Kerrigan, the reporter, mentioned, and he actually showed, was that flag is everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really literally everywhere from one end of the state to the other.
Right.
And yeah, there are different versions of it, and some have a simple tree, some have a more complicated tree.
Yeah.
There's at least 5 companies in Maine that are making it. There's another 6 or 7 outside of Maine that are making it. I think that all speaks to popularity.
Yeah.
I mean, anywhere from, for example, CRW Flags in Maryland makes an exact copy of the original 1901 flag with all the details in it. Or you can go to the main flag company in Portland and get a very simplified version, and anything in between.
Yeah.
And they're everywhere. I mean, and some people are flying multiple copies, different versions of the flag to cover their own bases, I guess you might say.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, hey, we'd rather just like this in general. We don't care which version, just get back to this in general.
Right. Yeah, and then there's the variants. I mean, you have the pride flag variants with the pine tree and star. I saw one time. I had a double take, but unfortunately I wasn't able to get a good picture of it. But it was the blue flag with the coat of arms, but in the Canton it was buff with the pine tree and star. Hey, combined the 2 of them. I mean, they couldn't make up their minds, so they did both.
I was going to say, and that person went out of their way to do that because they had to specially request that for sure.
Yeah, or they bought a small pine tree flag and sewed it on. I don't know how they did it.
Could be that, but either way, that's dedication to, the cause, broadly speaking.
Right.
And yeah, like what you were talking about as far as companies and people voting with their wallets, basically, like Michael Green has told me, and I think told you because he sat down with you just a few weeks ago, that Yeah, other than like I think pride flags are mostly their bread and butter, but outside of that, like the Maine 1901 is one of their biggest sellers. Like he even sent me this one
Yeah.
behind me as a double-sided because he was like, I really want to, this is one that sells well. I want to get it out there, all that stuff. And
Yeah, and I mean, I had an interview with him, and he was a little bit surprised when I told him basically they're all good. They all meet what I think is the requirement. It's something
yeah,
you can identify as a pine tree, and there's a star, and it's a buff color. Close enough.
yeah, yeah. I don't know why he was surprised by that. Michael, come on. Anyway, I
Well,
did.
you know, he's that. I gotta make a kind of an observation here that I think is important to understand, and that is that until the middle of the 20th century, flags really didn't have specifications. There were descriptions, usually written, and if you met that written description, you were good.
Mhm,
It began about after the First World War that people started to um, publish specifications. The specification for the U.S. flag, for example, was first put together in 1912.
yeah, yeah.
So it's a 20th century invention, and many people today cannot conceive of a flag that doesn't meet their idea of what the specification is,
Right. Yep.
and that is not traditionally the way it was
Yeah.
prior to the 20th century.
No,
So
definitely.
that's not a surprise, really. I mean, you
Yeah.
talk
Yeah.
to anybody here in this state about the current Maine flag, and they'll point to the blue one with the coat of arms that's maybe got pink trees behind the
Sure.
pine tree and all kinds of weird things going on in there. And
Yeah.
it's like that's the official flag. Well, no, it's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they can't get their head around the fact that the law specifies something very different.
Right. Right. And yeah, going back slightly, like I can actually, now that I think about it, and as you just mentioned, like I can see why Michael was a little surprised by that because he's, as I mentioned, sold so many of his 1901 main flags that, like,
Right.
I can't get into his head, but like if I were him, what I would guess is like, well, I've sold so many of these. This must be the preferred design kind of thing. And then you're just like, anyway,
And see, that goes back to what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago. So, if the Secretary of State gets her way and we put together this commission and we come up with a standardized design, is that going to change what these manufacturers are doing? Not in the least. We're going to see the same products by the same companies. They're all going to be different. It's still going to happen.
it's clearly not broken. So why would they fix it? They've been
Right.
selling it. Exactly.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. And just to briefly get into, because we do have to wrap up kind of soon, but Tara's last question actually, well, our conversation dovetails really nicely into this, but Tara just asked, how much does standardization matter, both in the case of Maine or in the case of other flags? And as you just said, that is kind of more of a 21st or late 20th century thing, the standardization of it. But in your opinion, how much does that matter, or how much bearing does that have on things? I think I know.
That goes back to something I said earlier. If it's at the top of a 75-foot flagpole,
Yeah.
who's going to notice the differences?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that part of using a symbolic language is that the symbols don't have to be perfect.
Right. Yeah. I think that's perfect. Well, Dave, I think it's time to start winding down here. For those who are patrons, Dave and I are going to talk for probably 15, 20 minutes after this on Patreon about some antique flags, their materials, design, all that stuff. It's actually something that's very fascinating because I've never really dove into it. But anyway, stay tuned. For everybody else, let's go ahead and get our plugs out there. Dave, do you have anything that you want to get some eyes and ears on? Follow you on social media, or follow any kind of project that you have or that your friend has?
No, I don't know. I don't do much social media.
Yeah.
I have a website. It's called vexman.net.
Okay.
You can usually get a hold of me through that. Like I said, I do a lot of research, and if you come across anything that's of interest, even if it's not a subject we've talked about today.
Yeah.
I'm always interested, especially in those obscure little tidbits of information that people come up with and they don't know what to do with. So
Absolutely.
I'm always good with that. Well, I mean, as an ex-president of NAVA, I mean, you should be exploring the NAVA website. There's a ton of material there. And I don't know. That's
There you go. Yeah. We'll plug that. No, that's perfect. As far as our plugs, you can find us over at linktree.com/flagged for content, all spelled out. Pretty sure that gets you there. It may be 4 like the number. I cannot remember on that one. But anyway, as mentioned several times during the course of this episode, come join us on Discord, which you can do from that link tree. Come join us on the Patreon, where Dave and I are going to have a talk where a lot of our past guests and I have gone over a little bit extra and talked about some other fun things. And just go find all our socials on any @based platform. We are @flagged for content or like the number. So, Dave, I think that's probably a good place to leave it here. And I cannot for the life of me remember where I put my notes on how to end this thing. But if I remember off air, you told me, assured me that you had something we could go out on here. And I'd love to hear that now.
So one of my predecessors as president of NAVA was a man named Scott Gunter, and as he always said, keep studying those flags.
Keep studying those flags, folks. You heard it here. Maybe not first, but you heard it here. And for those not on the Patreon, we will catch you all on the fly side. Take care. Flagged for Content is a Flags for Good podcast. Go to flagsforgood.com for more info.